In this video, we'll talk about the fractures that we are seeing in the Transatlantic Alliance. After the Second World War, North America and Europe entered into an alliance with the aim of establishing geopolitical stability across the Atlantic region. It was called the Transatlantic Alliance. It used to be a value-based and predictable partnership between the North American countries and the European nations. But we are noticing that under the current US administration, this partnership has degraded into a transactional arrangement. Earlier, we used to see efforts to maintain collective security and defend democratic values. But now we are seeing that it is transforming into a conditional cooperation. Defensive national interests are gaining priority, and this is leading to the fracturing of this relationship between North American countries and European nations. The core pillar of the alliance is its military and security architecture. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, serves as the institutional backbone of the Transatlantic Alliance. But the Greenland issue has dealt a blow to NATO. Greenland is an autonomous territory of the NATO member Denmark and is part of the Transatlantic Security Framework. America has repeatedly threatened to take control of Greenland. This act of the US demanding territorial concessions from a NATO ally has damaged the transatlantic relationship. European countries are uniting against what they see as aggressive US policies. In response, the US is adopting economic warfare tactics, pressuring European nations to place Greenland under US control by citing critical Arctic national security interests. As if only the interests of the US matter in this world. As if only the territorial integrity of the US is inviolable. When European nations stood up against US pressure and flatly rejected the US proposal to take over Greenland, Washington responded by weaponizing trade. It imposed tariffs on nations that oppose the US takeover of Greenland. Washington tried to force Europe into economic submission over the Greenland issue. This aggressive economic unilateralism by the US pushed Europe into adopting a defensive posture. So trade and economic coercion are one reason behind the strained ties. The second reason is crisis in West Asia. European nations were not happy with America's unilateral military escalation with Iran. When the US issued stern demands to its European allies for military personnel and logistical support, European nations flatly rejected them, saying, "This is not our war. We were not consulted before launching strikes on Iran. So now that Iran has closed the pivotal Strait of Hormuz, we are not going to provide military support to secure regional shipping lanes." Nations like Spain and Italy aggressively asserted their sovereignty. They explicitly denied the US military the right to use their domestic airfields and landing strips for offensive operations against Iran, as Iran had warned of massive retaliation. This further strained the Transatlantic Alliance. It led to a weakening of trust between the US and its European allies. The disagreements over the war in West Asia kept growing. Strategic priorities continued to diverge. Views on security differed. This contributed to the fracturing of the Transatlantic Alliance. Moreover, the US is increasing pressure on Europe to spend more on defense. Now Europe is realizing that relying heavily on the US for security through NATO is no longer a good idea. The reliability of the US is being questioned. There are concerns that in the future, the US may further reduce its commitments to European security. The world has already seen how US abandoned its allies in the Gulf when Iran was attacking them left, right and center. This is the reason Europe is now investing more in its own defense capabilities. It is trying to reduce its dependence on America, which is contributing to the fracturing of the alliance. The presidency of Donald Trump has raised concerns in Europe about the reliability of the US security guarantees. The America First agenda of the current US administration is coming in the way of strategic solidarity. This is also evident in Ukraine. The collective West's unity in the Ukraine war has drastically eroded. The US administration is consistently trying to redirect funding away from Ukraine and toward domestic priorities. As a result, the European countries are feeling deeply isolated. Rather than operating within a unified transatlantic diplomatic framework, the US sidelined Europe during major peace-broking discussions. This has caused a trust deficit and a breakdown in solidarity. Trump's softer stance toward Russia has left European countries concerned. Now differences are emerging between the US and Europe over military aid to Ukraine and over how long support for Ukraine should continue. This is leading to policy differences within the alliance. European countries are unhappy because rather than acting like close partners, they are facing threats and economic coercion from Washington. This is pushing Europe towards strategic autonomy, reducing its dependence on the US, manufacturing its own weapons, developing its own defense industry, and making independent foreign policy decisions. Of course, the US is not happy with this. This is causing further strain in the relationship. Then there is a different approach towards China. For America, China is the greatest strategic competitor and its biggest rival. For Europe, China does pose challenges, but it is one country that cannot simply be done away with. So Europe wants to preserve its trade and investment ties with China. European countries want to continue their strategic engagement with China while reducing their strategic risks. Europe no longer wants the US to dictate its policies. European countries are already bearing the burden of high energy costs. Before 2022, Europe depended heavily on Russian gas. But after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the West imposed sanctions on Russia, and Europe was actively encouraged to reduce its imports from Russia. Now, who was the beneficiary of this move? America. Europe increased its imports of LNG from the US. American LNG was expensive, but Europe had limited options. So US energy companies benefited, while Europe bore higher energy costs. The increasing domestic pressure in Europe because of high energy costs has led to shifting strategic priorities. Then there is also friction over digital regulation. The European Union has introduced stricter rules for large technology companies, many of which are American. This has also led to tensions among the allies. America does not like Europe's attempts to curb the monopoly of US big tech companies. Then there are disagreements over climate policy as well. Europe supports the green transition, while the US under Donald Trump has pursued aggressive fossil fuel expansion and deregulation. Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act has stripped away green incentives. So the Trump administration's prioritization of short-term gains is leading to actions that is eroding the underlying trust between the allies. Then Donald Trump's behavior is also one factor that is leading to tensions among the allies. The root of the friction is the shift from polite disagreements to open public condemnation and public insults. The arrogance of the US leadership is leading to the structural fragmentation of the traditional Transatlantic Alliance. It is pushing European states away from America. Europe does not want to act as a compliant junior partner to the US. European countries believe that if Washington wants cooperation, it must offer mutual respect rather than coercion. Countries like Spain and Italy have shown how to stand up to the US intimidation and bullying rather than bending to US policy demands out of fear of US retaliation. European nations are starting to call out Washington's bluff. They are realizing that security and economic dependencies run both ways. That is why they are beginning to call out the US administration's unprofessionalism and impoliteness. This is serving as a blueprint for other countries to resist US pressure. Spain has led the way by being one of the most vociferous critics of aggressive US foreign policy. It explicitly refused to be dragged into the West Asian conflict. It openly called the US attack on Iran illegal under international law and stated that the US's behavior was against standard diplomatic protocols that dictate that disagreements between allies should be handled quietly through diplomatic channels. Public humiliation and the use of foul and unparliamentary language violate the long-standing norms of mutual respect between sovereign nations. The nations of the world must unite in reminding the US of this fact. Recently, Italy has also shown how a nation can protect its institutional dignity. When Trump falsely claimed that Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni had desperately begged him for a photograph at the G7 summit, Italy did not choose quiet appeasement. Meloni decided to reject the personal humiliation and bullying by Trump. She released a direct rebuttal, explicitly stating, quote-unquote, "Neither I nor Italy ever beg," thereby publicly calling out the US administration for its heavy-handed approach. This also serves as a lesson for countries like India to stop bowing to America First demands and instead establish firm boundaries to defend their national sovereignty and strategic interests. India could have given a stronger response to the false American claims about its role in pausing Operation Sindoor, its aggressive tariff strategy, its name-calling directed at India, and the most recent irresponsible attack in which 3 Indian sailors lost their lives. As soon as Trump made the false claim, the Italian Prime Minister immediately chose to issue a strong public rebuttal. The Italian minister cancelled his planned visit to the US in protest against Trump's disrespectful remarks. This is what self-respect looks like. Earlier too, if you remember, when Pope Leo condemned the West Asian War, Trump launched sharp public criticism against the Pope. Even then, Prime Minister Meloni defended the Pope, calling Trump's attacks unacceptable. That is how it should be. A red line needs to be drawn. Nations will have to understand that the sky is not going to fall if they say no to the US. The economies are interconnected. Dependencies go both ways. Silence strengthens the bully. It is a major policy blunder that the US continues to alienate its allies over personal grievances. Because of this, at a time when unity is required to face shared global challenges, America's actions are instead leading to the weakening of transatlantic solidarity. The ego and hubris of the present US administration, along with its inability to handle personal disputes in a civilized manner, are resulting in the trivialization of serious geopolitical relationships. We are noticing a pattern of behavior that is highly detrimental to traditional statecraft. This unprofessional behavior, combined with deep structural disagreements, is ruining the relationship between the transatlantic allies.